I still remember that exact moment when I pushed the door open and everything went silent. I wasn't supposed to be home yet. I heard voices from upstairs, her voice, and another man's voice. My heart started racing. I didn't even take my shoes off. I just walked up the stairs and when I opened that bedroom door, I saw something I can never forget for the rest of my life. She looked at me, frozen, like time stopped. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a mistake. This had been going on for months. I just didn't know it yet. For the longest time, my life felt like something I could finally be proud of. Like I had reached a point where everything was stable, predictable, and honestly, peaceful in a way I never thought I would experience. I had a wife I trusted completely, a home that felt warm and familiar, and a routine that made me believe nothing in my life could really fall apart if I just kept doing what I was supposed to do every day. We weren't perfect, of course. No marriage is, but I genuinely believed we were solid. Like we had built something over the years that could survive anything, and I never once thought I would end up questioning the person I trusted the most in this world. She used to be different back then. Or at least, that's how I remember it now when I look back and try to understand where everything started to shift. Because at the time, I didn't notice anything unusual at all. She would still laugh at small things. She would still talk about her day. She would still sit next to me in the evenings like we had all the time in the world. And even when life got busy, there was always this sense that we were on the same team, moving in the same direction, without any real distance between us. I never had a reason to doubt her, and honestly, I never even thought about the possibility that I would need to. Our days were simple, sometimes even boring in a comforting way, the kind of routine that most people would probably take for granted, but I saw it as stability. I would go to work, deal with whatever problems came up during the day, come home in the evening, and she would usually be there, either cooking, scrolling on her phone, or talking about something random that happened during her day, and everything felt normal enough that I never questioned the small details. We had our habits, our little patterns, the things couples fall into over time without even realizing it, and I thought that was a good sign, something that meant we understood each other without needing to constantly prove it. But looking back now, I realize there were moments I completely ignored. Small things that didn't seem important at the time, but slowly started to form a picture I couldn't see back then. There were times she would seem a little distracted when I talked to her, like her mind was somewhere else, but I always assumed she was just tired or thinking about work or something completely harmless. There were moments when her phone would light up and she would quickly turn it face down, but I told myself that everyone values privacy, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who doubts their partner over nothing. Even when she started going out a bit more often, saying she needed space, or meeting friends she didn't talk much about, I didn't question it deeply, because I trusted her. And trust, at that time, felt like something unbreakable. I remember one evening in particular, nothing special about the day itself, just another normal day that ended the way most of our days did, with me coming home and her already being there, but something about her energy felt slightly different. She was quieter than usual, not in a way that immediately raised alarm, but enough that I noticed it in the back of my mind. When I asked her how her day was, she gave me a short answer and smiled, but it didn't feel the same as before. Like the smile was there because it had to be, not because she actually felt it. Still, I didn't push it because I believed relationships go through small phases, and I didn't want to create problems where there weren't any. At that point in my life, I truly thought I understood my marriage. I thought I knew the person I was living with, and I thought that whatever we had built together was strong enough to handle anything life could throw at us. I didn't think secrets could exist between us. Not real ones anyway, and I certainly didn't think that something serious could be happening right under my nose without me noticing it. That's why I kept going normally, day after day, without ever suspecting that the foundation I was standing on was already starting to crack in ways I couldn't see yet. And the worst part is, I felt safe, completely safe. At first, it wasn't anything obvious or dramatic that made me start thinking something was wrong. It was more like a series of small moments that didn't make sense on their own, but slowly started to build a feeling inside me that I couldn't fully explain, like a quiet discomfort that I kept pushing away because I didn't want to believe it meant anything serious. It's strange how the human mind works, because even when you notice changes in someone you love, you can still find ways to justify everything, to convince yourself that you're overthinking, that you're being paranoid, that nothing is actually happening behind the surface. One of the first things I remember was her phone behavior changing. Not in a sudden or obvious way, but gradually. Almost like she was training herself to be more careful without me noticing the process. She started keeping her phone closer to her at all times, even in situations where she never used to care about it before. And whenever it lit up with a message or notification, she would instinctively react faster than usual, sometimes flipping it face down or slightly moving it away from my line of sight. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she just wanted privacy. Maybe she was talking to friends about things she didn't feel like sharing in the moment, and I tried very hard not to let my imagination turn small habits into big accusations, but there were other things too, things that were harder to ignore, the more they repeated themselves. There were evenings when she would suddenly say she had plans, sometimes very last minute, and even though I asked simple questions like where she was going or who she was meeting, her answers would sometimes feel slightly too vague, like she was choosing words carefully instead of speaking naturally. I noticed she started spending more time getting ready than before, not dramatically different every time, but enough that I could feel a shift in her routine, like something about going out had become more important than it used to be. What made it even more confusing was that she didn't act guilty or nervous in a clear way, at least not in a way I could easily recognize at the time. In fact, she often seemed completely normal, even happy in certain moments, which made me doubt myself more than anything else. Because when someone acts normal, you start questioning your own instincts. You start thinking, maybe you're imagining patterns that don't exist, and that's exactly what I did. I kept telling myself that relationships evolve, people change habits, and there was no reason for me to turn innocent behavior into suspicion. Still, there were nights when I couldn't ignore the feeling completely, especially when she would come home later than expected and act like everything was fine, without offering many details unless I asked directly. And even then, her answers sometimes felt slightly incomplete, like she was telling just enough to satisfy a question, but not enough to create a full picture. I remember lying in bed next to her sometimes, listening to her breathing, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything, but at the same time, feeling that something inside me was slowly shifting, like a small crack forming in a wall I thought was solid. The hardest part was that I didn't have proof of anything, only feelings and small inconsistencies that I couldn't connect properly. And because I had trusted her for so long, I kept choosing trust over doubt every single time. I didn't want to become suspicious without reason. I didn't want to damage something that might still be perfectly fine. And I think that's what made everything more dangerous in the end, because I was ignoring the signs, not because I didn't see them, but because I didn't want them to be real. And still, even with all of that building up quietly in the background, I had no idea that I was already getting closer to the moment that would change everything I believed about my life. At some point, I stopped noticing single strange moments and started noticing patterns, even though I still refused to fully accept what those patterns could mean, because once you start connecting dots in a situation like this, it becomes harder to lie to yourself. And I think deep down, I was still trying to protect the version of my life that I believed was real. But the truth is, when things are wrong for long enough, they don't stay hidden forever. They start showing themselves in ways that you can't completely ignore, even if you try your best to do exactly that. It began with contradictions, small ones at first, the kind that you could almost excuse if you wanted to, but they kept repeating in different forms. She would tell me one version of something she did during the day, and then later, without even realizing it, she would say something slightly different that didn't match the earlier story. And while each individual detail wasn't enough to mean anything on its own, together they started forming something that didn't feel random anymore. I remember trying to keep track of it in my head, replaying conversations in silence, wondering if I was misunderstanding or misremembering, because I didn't want to believe that someone I trusted so deeply could be inconsistent without a reason. There were also moments when her explanations felt too prepared, like she had already thought about what she was going to say before I even asked the question, and that created a strange feeling in me that I didn't know how to interpret at the time. Because when someone answers too quickly or too smoothly, it can sometimes feel reassuring, but other times it feels rehearsed, and I didn't want to admit to myself that I was starting to lean toward the second option. I kept telling myself that maybe she was just organized, maybe she was good at planning her words, maybe I was overthinking things again. But that internal voice of doubt was getting harder to silence. I also started paying attention to the timing of things, like when she left, when she returned, how long certain errands supposedly took, and even though I hated the fact that I was doing it, I couldn't stop myself because Once suspicion starts forming, it doesn't just disappear by ignoring it. I would sit there trying to calculate whether her stories made sense, whether the time frames matched, whether everything lined up logically, and sometimes it did, but other times there were gaps that didn't feel right. Small, empty spaces in the timeline that she never really explained in detail. What made everything even more confusing was that she still acted normal in most situations, like nothing inside our relationship had changed, and that contrast between her behavior and the inconsistencies I was noticing created a constant internal conflict in me. On one hand, I had the person I loved acting like everything was fine, and on the other hand, I had a growing list of things that didn't fully add up, and I didn't know which one I should trust more. And the longer this went on, the more exhausted I became mentally, because I was constantly trying to balance trust and doubt at the same time without letting either one completely take over. I remember one night sitting alone in the kitchen after she had already gone to bed, just thinking about everything in silence, replaying conversations in my head again and again, trying to find a logical explanation that would make all of it harmless. But for the first time, I couldn't fully convince myself that nothing was wrong. And it wasn't a clear conclusion yet. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even close to certainty. But it was the first time I admitted to myself that something in my life didn't feel as stable as it used to. And even though I still didn't know the truth, I was already getting too close to it to turn back. I still remember that day with a kind of clarity that feels almost unfair, like my brain decided to permanently store every detail of it, even the ones that seemed completely meaningless at the time, because somehow my life split into a before and after from that exact moment, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet on the surface. It started like a normal day, the kind of day you don't expect anything from, the kind where you think everything will repeat itself exactly the same as yesterday, and you just move through your routine without questioning anything. But something small disrupted that routine in a way I didn't fully understand at first. It wasn't a huge event. Not at the beginning, at least. It was more like a coincidence that didn't belong in my normal pattern of life. I remember I came home earlier than usual that day, not because I planned to, but because something at work got canceled unexpectedly, and instead of staying longer like I normally would, I decided to head back without telling her, thinking it would just be a normal surprise. Nothing more than that. I didn't think twice about it at the time. I didn't feel anything unusual. I was just going home like I always did, expecting the same quiet, predictable atmosphere I had grown used to. When I walked inside the house, everything seemed normal at first glance. Almost too normal, like nothing had changed at all. The lights were on in a familiar way. There were small signs of life everywhere that made the place feel lived in and safe. And for a few seconds, I honestly didn't suspect anything at all. I even remember thinking I might just grab something to eat, maybe sit down for a bit and enjoy the unexpected free time, because nothing in that moment was signaling danger or change. But then I heard something. At first it was faint, just a sound that didn't fully register in my mind, like background noise you don't immediately assign meaning to. It came from upstairs, and I remember pausing for a second without even realizing why I stopped moving, because my brain was trying to identify what I had just heard. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but there was something about it that didn't fit the silence of the house in that moment. And then I heard it again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. There were two. And that's when something inside me shifted instantly, not slowly, not gradually, but like a switch being flipped in my mind that turned confusion into alertness in a fraction of a second. I remember standing there completely still, trying to process what I was hearing, because my brain was refusing to jump to conclusions, even though my instincts were already starting to react before I had time to think logically. I didn't move at first, I just listened, and the longer I stood there, the more real it became that this wasn't something normal, this wasn't a misunderstanding, and this wasn't part of my usual life. I started walking upstairs without even deciding to do it consciously, like my body moved before my thoughts fully caught up, and every step felt heavier than the last, even though nothing physically was stopping me. I remember my heart beginning to beat faster, not in panic yet, but in that strange state where you know something is about to happen, but you don't know what exactly you're about to see. The house suddenly felt different, like the air itself had changed, even though everything around me still looked the same. And then I reached the door. I stopped for a second right in front of it, and I can't explain exactly why I paused. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was the part of me still hoping that I was wrong about everything I had just started to suspect. But I stood there for a moment, listening again, and in that silence, I realized I couldn't go back to not knowing anymore, because whatever was behind that door was going to change something permanently. I reached for the handle and I opened the door. After that moment, something in me completely changed. Even though on the outside I tried to act like everything was still normal, because I didn't want her to notice that my mind had shifted into a different state where I was no longer just living in trust, but also living in observation, constantly analyzing everything she said and did, even when I tried not to, even when I told myself that I shouldn't be doing it, that I was going too far, that I needed to calm down and stop overthinking, but I couldn't. Once you see something that breaks your sense of reality, you don't just forget it. You start rebuilding your understanding of everything that came before it. At first, I didn't confront her. I didn't ask direct questions because I knew that if I did, she would immediately become more careful and I wouldn't get real answers anymore, only controlled ones. So instead, I started watching quietly, paying attention to patterns I had ignored before, noticing details I would normally never care about, like how she held her phone, how she reacted when notifications appeared, how quickly she locked her screen when I entered the room, even if I didn't say anything or look suspicious at all. I started realizing that sometimes the smallest reactions tell you more than words ever could, because words can be controlled, but instincts are harder to hide. I also began noticing her schedule more clearly, not because I wanted to invade her life, but because I suddenly felt like I needed to understand where the gaps were, where the missing pieces were hiding, and I started remembering exact times she left the house, exact times she came back, how long she said she would be gone, compared to how long she actually stayed out. And the more I compared things in my mind, the more uncomfortable it became, because there were moments that didn't fully align, small inconsistencies that didn't prove anything on their own, but together started forming a picture I didn't want to see. There were nights when she would say she was tired and go to bed earlier than me, and I would stay in the living room pretending to watch something on TV. But in reality, I wasn't paying attention to anything on the screen. I was just thinking, replaying everything I had noticed during the day, trying to find a logical explanation that would make all of it harmless. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I was letting one moment influence my entire perception of her, and that it wasn't fair to judge someone based on suspicion alone. But even while thinking that, I couldn't fully turn off the part of my mind that was now alert all the time. One of the hardest parts was how normal she still acted in many moments, because it created this constant internal conflict inside me where I couldn't tell if I was discovering something real or just imagining patterns that didn't exist. She would still talk to me, still smile, still behave like everything was fine between us, and sometimes she would even initiate normal conversations about everyday things, which made me question myself even more, because I didn't know how someone could be hiding something serious while still acting so calm and natural at the same time. And that confusion made everything more exhausting, because I wasn't just trying to find the truth, I was also trying to hold on to my trust at the same time. But slowly, without me even realizing it at first, I started changing my habits too. I became quieter when I was around her, more observant, less relaxed, and I started noticing that I was paying attention to things I used to ignore completely, like the exact moment her phone screen lit up, the direction of her gaze when she answered certain questions, the tone of her voice when she spoke about plans I wasn't included in. And I hated that I was becoming this version of myself because I didn't want to live in suspicion. I didn't want to become someone who questions every detail of their partner's life. But at the same time, I felt like I had no choice anymore because ignoring it felt even worse than noticing it. There was one evening in particular that stayed in my mind more than the others, even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface. She told me she was going out again, just like before. Nothing unusual in her tone, nothing that would make me react differently if I was still the same person I was a few weeks ago. She got ready like normal. She checked her phone like normal. She kissed me goodbye like normal, and for anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like a completely ordinary moment in a relationship. But for me, everything felt different internally, because now I was watching instead of just living. After she left, I didn't immediately go back to my routine. I just sat there for a while in silence, trying to decide what I should do with everything I was feeling. I kept thinking about whether I should trust her completely and stop this mental spiral, or whether I should continue paying attention until I understood what was really happening. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't able to go back to ignorance anymore, because once your mind starts connecting details, it doesn't just unsee them. So I started making a decision without fully admitting it to myself yet, a decision that I wasn't going to confront anything directly, but I also wasn't going to ignore anything anymore. I would watch, I would listen, I would remember everything, even the smallest details that didn't seem important at the moment, because somewhere deep inside, I already felt that the truth wasn't going to reveal itself through one big moment again, but through a collection of small pieces that would eventually become impossible to deny. And I didn't realize it yet, but I was already getting closer to the point where there would be no more guessing, no more doubts, and no more maybe. There are certain days in life that don't feel special when they start, days that begin exactly like any other ordinary day, where nothing seems out of place, where your mind is still carrying the same mix of suspicion and denial that you've been living with for a while, but you still wake up and try to function normally because you don't have anything concrete enough to act on. And that's exactly how this day started for me, without any warning, without any feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. In the morning, everything felt quiet and controlled. She was acting like she always did recently. Nothing unusual in her tone, nothing that would stand out if you didn't already have doubts in your mind. And I remember watching her move around the house, preparing for her day, checking her phone, organizing small things like she always did. And from the outside, it looked completely normal, almost peaceful. But inside me, there was this constant tension that I couldn't fully turn off anymore, like I was waiting for something I couldn't define. At some point, she told me she was going out again, and I didn't ask many questions this time, not because I trusted everything fully, but because I had reached a point where asking questions didn't feel like it would give me real answers anymore. So I just watched quietly as she got ready, trying to read her behavior without making it obvious that I was paying attention. She left the house the same way she always did, calm, natural, no hesitation, no visible sign that anything was different. And I remember standing there for a moment after the door closed, just listening to the silence that followed. That silence felt heavier than usual. I didn't know why at the time, but I didn't go back to what I was doing before. Instead, I stayed alert, I stayed aware, and something inside me made me feel like I shouldn't just let the day pass normally. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't something I had fully decided in advance. It was more like an instinct that I couldn't ignore anymore. A feeling that if I didn't pay attention right now, I might miss something I would never get a chance to understand again. So, I made a decision without fully thinking it through. I left the house a little later, trying not to make it obvious, trying not to create any situation where she would suspect that I was following anything. And as I moved through the day, everything felt strangely unreal, like I was stepping out of my normal life into something I wasn't supposed to be part of. I remember the way I kept checking my surroundings, the way every small detail suddenly felt important, the way my mind was constantly trying to predict what I might see next, while also hoping that I wouldn't see anything at all. At some point I saw her. Just seeing her from a distance was enough to change the entire direction of my thoughts in that moment, because she wasn't where she said she would be, and she wasn't alone. I remember stopping completely, just watching, without moving, trying to understand what I was actually seeing before my emotions fully reacted to it, because part of me still wanted a different explanation, something harmless, something that would make everything fit into a normal version of reality. But then I saw how she interacted, the way she stood, the way she leaned slightly closer than she ever did with me recently, the way she seemed comfortable in a way that didn't match the distance I had felt between us for weeks. And in that moment, I didn't need anyone to explain anything to me anymore, because my brain finally connected all the pieces I had been collecting for so long, and everything I had been trying to ignore suddenly became impossible to deny. I don't even remember moving at first after that. I just remember the feeling like something inside me collapsed silently, not with noise or drama, but with a quiet finality that hit harder than anything loud ever could. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't doubt. It was understanding. And that understanding felt heavier than anything I had ever felt before. I didn't approach immediately. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, processing the fact that everything I had been trying to protect in my mind for so long wasn't real in the way I believed it was. And the hardest part wasn't even what I saw, it was realizing how long it had been happening without me knowing. How many moments I had misunderstood, how many signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in something that was already breaking. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't go back to not knowing anymore, because now I had seen enough to understand that everything had already changed long before I ever realized it. I don't even know how to properly describe what happens to a person in the hours after their entire reality collapses, because it's not like in movies where everything becomes dramatic and loud. It's actually much quieter than that, almost unreal. Like your mind is trying to protect you by not letting everything fully register at once. And instead, it just leaves you in this strange emotional emptiness where you're physically present, but mentally still stuck in the moment that broke you. After what I saw, I didn't immediately confront her. I didn't rush in with questions or accusations. I just stayed distant for a while because part of me needed time to process what had already happened before I added anything more to it. And I remember walking without a clear direction, just moving through streets like my body was on autopilot, while my thoughts kept replaying the same images over and over again, trying to make them feel less real by repetition. But it didn't work. Eventually, I went back home, because no matter how much everything inside me was changing, that place was still my default, the place where my life had been built, even if now it felt completely different. When I walked inside, everything looked exactly the same as it always did, and that contrast alone made it worse, because nothing in the environment reflected what I was feeling inside. It was the same walls, the same silence, the same ordinary objects. But for me, nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. She came back later like nothing had happened. That was the part that shocked me the most, not because she acted guilty or emotional, but because she acted normal, completely normal, as if my entire world hadn't just shifted a few hours earlier. She walked in, greeted me in the same way, put her things down, and started talking about small, everyday things like the day had been routine, and for a moment I just stood there listening, trying to understand how two people could be living in the same reality but experiencing completely different truths. I remember looking at her and feeling something I had never felt toward her before. Not immediately anger, not immediately sadness, but a kind of deep emotional disconnect. Like my mind was trying to separate the version of her I used to love from the version of her I was seeing now, and those two versions didn't match anymore. Everything she said sounded distant, like it was coming from someone I used to know but didn't fully recognize in that moment. At some point, I finally asked her. I didn't shout, I didn't explode. I just asked a simple question, because I needed to hear how she would explain what I had already seen with my own eyes. And the second I asked it, I noticed a change in her expression. Just a small one. Something subtle, but enough for me to understand that she knew exactly what I was referring to. And in that moment, the air between us changed completely, like the conversation had moved from normal life into something irreversible. Her response wasn't immediate at first. There was hesitation, a pause that felt longer than it actually was, and then she started speaking in a way that didn't feel fully honest, like she was trying to construct something on the spot rather than explain something that was already true. She said words, but they didn't connect into a story that made sense with what I had seen, and I remember standing there realizing that I wasn't just listening anymore. I was comparing everything she said to the reality I had already witnessed. That was the moment everything finally broke completely, not because of one sentence, not because of one confession, but because I realized that there was no version of this situation where things could go back to how they were before, because even if I tried to ignore it, even if I tried to forgive it, even if I tried to rebuild something from it, the trust that everything was built on was already gone, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. After that, the conversation stopped mattering in the same way, because I wasn't looking for explanations anymore. I was just understanding the end of something I had once believed was permanent. And when she realized I wasn't accepting her version of the story, the silence between us became heavier than anything either of us could say. I remember eventually sitting down alone later that night, not really thinking, just existing, trying to process the fact that the life I thought I had was no longer the life I actually had, and that the person I trusted most had become someone I could no longer see in the same way again. And in that silence, I understood something I didn't want to accept, that some things don't break loudly, they don't end with closure, they just stop being what they used to be, and you're left trying to understand how you got from forever to it's over without ever noticing the exact moment it changed.